Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we are back with another entry into the new player guide Mythic Plus learning session. This is going to be season 3 dungeons, and we are starting with the 2 newest dungeons. That's right, 2 new dungeons coming to season 3, coming out of Tazavesh here. So this is a dungeon that I don't feel like a lot of people have done, especially in Legion and BFA. There was a little bit more reason to do these Mythic Zeros, but there wasn't really a lot of reason to do Tazavesh. And I can imagine a lot of you guys might be seeing this dungeon for the first time, which would be a very, very bad thing if the opening weeks you get a high Tazavesh key that you don't know anything about. So I'm joined by my good friend Cop here, who is relatively inexperienced with Mythic Plus, and we're going to try to learn everything we need to from both perspectives so a new player can learn, and also an experienced player who's coming into these dungeons for the first time can also have that flex. So Cop, tell me a little bit about how you feel about Tazavesh and maybe what you know and where you're starting with it.
I find it a very interesting dungeon. I think it's got a lot of unique mechanics to it, but my starting with it was I did the attunement once, and that was when it first came out, like the first 2-3 weeks. So I remember zero about these bosses, essentially. So treat me like a tourist, my friend.
And where would you say the last time you did the dungeon was?
Probably week 4 that it was available at latest.
So probably like 5 months ago or something?
Yep, probably about that. Yeah, 4 or 5 months ago.
And so I expect a lot of people to be in that boat where they're doing these dungeons, even if they did do them at one point, and it has been months since they've done them. So this dungeon especially is very similar to the lower version of Karazhan or the junkyard version of Mechagon, in that there is an inordinate amount of trash, an absolute massive amount of trash. And frankly, I don't really know what a route through this dungeon is going to look like in terms of optimizing the trash. So we're going to try to talk about every single element of it and try to learn as much as you can. These guys cannot be skipped here. There's not going to be any hard mode elements involved in Mythic Zero or Mythic Plus this version as well. So if you've never done it at all, you probably don't have this worry, but I think a lot of people probably did this so often on hard mode that some of the things might start to bleed together, and you might be confusing what looks like actual Mythic mechanics with what might be different in Mythic Plus. In general, this should be a pretty poor opening pack. There's these bombs in the ground that you're going to have to avoid, but other than that, the big problem here is that this is the only trash you could fight right now, unless you want to really get aggressive and start pulling them up. The opening packs have almost no real mechanics going on, but there's usually just 1 or 2 interrupts or things like of that nature that you need to be aware of. So I can see, especially if this is where you have the fix, it could have been a very good idea to potentially pull that pack in with one of these packs. And we always like to talk about getting a first very good pull, because that means every CD is up no matter what. You have all your CDs up at the start of a dungeon, and that kind of thing could be really important to make sure you're maximizing on a trash heavy dungeon like this. And frankly, I don't see any actual mechanics that would stop you from doing so. So key to trash heavy dungeons like this is making intelligent decisions on what you're pulling together, and this room is going to be one that you really need to be aware of, because it has a lot of specific interruptible mechanics that if you can get easily, you will be able to combine, but if you do not, you will miss. You'll get some big mistakes here. So starting on the right here, we have custom security, and this has a few abilities that you really need to be aware of, but for the most part, it's going to be more of a bait interrupt mob that's going to cast a lot of spells but aren't really that important that you actually interrupt. One of the mechanics right there is that hard light barrier, and that is on the support officer. Making sure you get that interrupt there is very important, because if you do not, it's going to put a very large shield on the enemy. All the while, you'll be fighting them alongside mobs like this custom security, which is going to be dropping more stuff on the ground, kind of like that first mob we saw. And this hyper light bolt cast here is kind of a bait interrupt. We want to instead let that cast go off unless we have an abundance of interruptible options, and we're just going to make sure we get the hard light barrier instead, which does put a pretty large absorb on the target. So if you're going to combine this with a few of these mobs, those are the key casts. If you let those casts go off constantly, you're going to have a lot of extra health to push through. And ultimately, the most important option in this room is going to be the Interrogation Specialist. The main interruptible ability that you need to watch for that mob is called Stasis Beam. This is similar to an ability you might see in Necrotic Wake or previous expansion dungeons as well, where as long as that cast is being channeled, it is going to stun the target. And if we don't actually interrupt that, we're going to basically just have one of our DPS unable to act. Now this ability is a magic effect, so if you're a class that has some way to prevent that from stunning you or killing you, then you could easily use that like AMS. Simply AMS the stun and you won't actually get stunned, or perhaps Icebound it as well, as it's a stun, anything that will prevent either a stun or a magic application to you will help with this situation. So at this point in the dungeon, now we're coming up to the time where you could potentially go right to the boss here and you could fight him, but there's a lot of trash in the way. And in hard mode, the way that works is that's part of the fight. You can actually have the trash kind of standing back here, and you could fight the boss with his kind of mini boss attachment and kill that all in that corner there. So it's already very known to be possible to do it like this, but I think realistically most groups probably will simply not try to skip any trash in this room and instead pull out the whole room and just make sure it's as safe as possible. And again, you might easily find yourself baited into a situation like we have right here, where we have 2 packs converging, and both of them, as we see, have 3 specialists and 2 of the Hyperlight Boltcasters. So we're going to have a lot of interrupts needed. It's extremely unlikely that we're going to get them all, but with you having a Blood Decay or something that has a lot of interrupts as a tank, this is going to be something that, as you know, as this tank, you can really make a big impact on this group. So instead, you might opt for a more conservative puller, especially since this pack alone has 3 casters, all of which need interrupting. And it's probably pretty easy to go ahead and line of sight these out of the room too if you absolutely needed to, especially with the patrols coming around the corner. Now, considering how difficult this trash might be under certain circumstances, it's probably really important to be very careful about what you actually pull when too. Not just whether or not you want to combine it, but how you want to aggro this room. Standing here and fighting this right pack sounds like a good idea, and even line of sighting it out of this area might be a decent option. But considering this pack can kind of pats around the whole center here, it's very likely that this might aggro as well. So I think if you have a good opportunity to get this patrol when it's at the apex, you should consider doing that, because all of these mobs are casters, so it's extremely unlikely that even aggroing them at a good time will get them clear of the patrol. And I think it's very, very common that you might end up actually aggroing both packs even if you don't want to. So even though the room does present some clear danger, just making sure you're interrupting the spells like Hard Light Barrier and Stasis Beam will make it a lot easier. But it is still incredibly difficult to combine and will require extreme precision to be able to combine multiple of those mobs together and still get all the interrupts you need without causing great detriment to your group. So now we're on to what looks like the first boss, but this is actually a mini boss. And I've done this multiple times with people who think this is the first boss and they pop all their CDs on it as well, and you know, it dies pretty quick. That's great, but then you have the actual boss coming up, so pay attention to that. Maybe there will be a case where you'll want to use all your CDs on this guy instead of the boss, like perhaps on a fortified week over a tyrannical week. He does have some mechanics which we'll talk about, but I really think most groups would probably prefer to use all their CDs, including their first Bloodlust or Heroism, on the first boss instead of on the trash. The main thing he does is these weird little rift blasts, they're called, and it's basically a line. It's always going to aim at the person at a different orientation, so you're pretty much going to always have to move to some degree. If you do it really well, you'll only have to move a little bit, but I think for the most part, especially if it's always on you as the tank, you're going to have to constantly be moving in very angular ways that you might be unfamiliar with. And I think, you know, for the most part, this is not very dangerous, to be honest. So just making sure the whole group isn't getting hit by it is probably more important than you as an individual, especially if you're playing a tank, not getting hit by it. But it does get pretty complicated, and this is probably one of the major things you notice when you fight this trash with the boss on hard mode Tazavesh. I believe that there will be no way to actually do this, but just in case there is some way in the future, just make sure if you're fighting these two together, you're always killing this as fast as possible, because it really makes it difficult, especially if you're a caster and you constantly have to move from this. Okay, so now we're on to the first of 5 bosses in the dungeon. So this is a 5 boss dungeon, and that's a really important thing on its own, because it means that you're going to want to really try to maximize lust. Theater of Pain is another 5 boss dungeon, and you know that getting 4 lusts in that dungeon is incredibly important to succeeding on a tyrannical key. This boss is definitely one of the best possible targets for Bloodlust though, because he does a lot of mechanics that disable you, and as of what we're seeing right now in the PTR, also comes intact with a very powerful seasonal affix buff. So we're going to quickly kill the one we want, and then we're going to take a look at the boss itself, and hopefully those two things together will make the boss much more approachable than normal. The boss has a few persistent mechanics, and you're going to see him throw his blade down on the ground. Armed security is the name of that one. You just need to make sure you keep dodging that, and I think it's always going to target people on the ground, so you definitely just want to make sure that you're moving the boss as well as not just the person. He's also going to do this frontal shield that you need to just make sure your group is behind, otherwise they'll reflect damage. And then that mechanic there, he's going to take your weapon and try to force you to find it. Usually it's pretty easy to find. You can simply just look around the room and make sure that you're near it. But this is the main mechanic right here, interrogation. So this person is going to get selected, and they're going to get picked and put into a containment cell. Now you have basically as long as the boss has distance between them to get the person out. And if you're in this situation here where the person doesn't recognize that and doesn't get far enough away, then it's extremely likely that they're going to die. This is also a stun and also a magic mechanic as well. So technically you can also AMS this mechanic as well, or use something like anti-magic shield and icebound fortitude to prevent. He'll do these mechanics in pretty often succession, so expect to see at least 3 or 4 of those mechanics, and the interrogation is really a main one. But as you see, what we're trying to do here is create a situation where the boss is so far away that he can't actually get to the player in that period of time, and that is a viable option too. I don't think it's realistic, but it is something that you can do as a last ditch effort if you feel like you really do need the help. If you are unable to kill the cell very quickly, you can simply run, you know, so far away that no matter how far he has to travel in those 30 seconds, he won't reach the target, and then they'll never be in any real danger of actually dying, provided you actually have a healer who's able to heal that person. They'll just sit in that for 30 seconds and it'll eventually expire. But you see, now that I'm alone, I have the interrogation, and he's going to try to target me with that, but I'm just going to AMS it, and it's not actually going to go on me. So that's something to keep in mind if you're playing like a Frost DK, or perhaps a Paladin, or something that has the ability to get rid of an ability like that. So to recap this boss, simply move out of the blades, make sure as the tank you're dragging him if you need to, so other people aren't staying in the blades. Stand on the opposite side of the shield. Make sure that you're always not attacking into the shield, otherwise you're losing a ton of damage. Pick up your armor whenever it gets taken from you. It should just always be in a little cell. And then whoever gets the interrogation mechanic, if you have no way of breaking it like a Paladin, or perhaps maybe a rogue or something like that as well, then everybody just has to switch to him and kill it as fast as possible. So once you've dispatched the first boss, you now have a choice to make here, it seems. Do we want to pull the extra trash here, potentially getting the seasonal fix, or do we want to hug the right side? This would probably actually be a decent place to try to execute a skip. This area here is definitely optional trash in all ways, and all you got to do is get outside and the dungeon continues. So when you're fighting these 2 mobs leaving this room, just make sure you're fighting 2 overseers, so you're going to have 2 sets of these beams. Melee especially will have to be particularly careful. Probably the tank roll job might want to try to move these farther and farther away, but usually it is pretty easy to just dodge them depending on where they spawn. But they will keep spawning more and more as the pack goes on, so just be careful with that. They do a lot of damage. You'll be surprised at how much damage that beam can actually do. But once you kill these here, you're on to the outside. Now at this point, you have a lot of choices you can make. You can go to any of the 3 bosses in this area in any order. And unlike Mechagon, there is seemingly no way to force you into doing one or the other. So this is where the trash decisions are going to come in. Now there's a couple ways you can go here though, and I would recommend probably avoiding these small mini bosses here. There's a mini boss here and a bunch of like gauntlet type stuff, but for the case of this video, assuming that will not be the case, we will certainly not be going that direction. Instead, we're going to go around to the right here, which is going to take us past the boss on the right here, the P.O.S.T, or perhaps the Maya's Oasis, depending on which direction you want to go first. Here there's going to be a stealth mob, the Cartel Skulker, wielding an incredibly nice weapon, and there will be a couple mobs like this along the way, but nothing too special. This trash should be a lot more easily multi-pulled. A lot of it is also very heavy magic type stuff, but all it requires is mostly dodging instead of actually interrupting this time, so it should be much easier to potentially pull it all. We do still have a Cartel Wise Guy casting many of the spells we've seen already, and we have these hyperlight bombs going on people. The main thing here is just making sure you're spread out and not potentially splashing that damage onto everyone else. But that mechanic there that you saw from the Wise Guy is going to put a giant circle on the ground. TLDR, just make sure you move out of that. If you get hit by that, you're going to take a ton of magic damage. Probably going to kill anybody who's not a tank. And looks like that hyperlight bomb actually only goes out on 1 person at a time there. Before we had 2, so 2 went out, but that time only 1 went out on top there. Skulker's also doing this quick blade mechanic, which does put a pretty substantial bleed on you, so it might potentially be dangerous, especially if you have a few of them like here. Here we have another patrolling pack, and this pack is going to be another complicating factor here. I assume we're probably going to want to try to skip this pack and then go around, but here yet again might be another really good option to try to execute a skip, or in some way just not fight this trash regardless of how you want to do it. So I think there's a pretty repeatable way to actually skip this here. You can kind of just run up on this wall and then get on this cart and then kind of jump to the left side, and you can actually walk by the pack to the left, the pack to the right, and as long as the patrol is nowhere in sight, you can just walk right into this area. So this is a pretty nice little way to skip some trash.
Yeah, I can see that being something that if you're not good at jumping puzzles, that is probably going to be something that's difficult for some people. But
so after executing and discovering the skip, we just had a very interesting learning moment here. I was able to make it. I jumped up on the ledge there and ran on top of the cart, but Cop had a little bit more trouble. Can you explain the situation there, Cop?
I was trying to jump up there, and I don't know whether it's just that I'm not used to being this character model or something. I had a lot of trouble kind of jumping up onto that wall skip there, and I know that's something that in other dungeons and stuff that we've done that I've had a little bit more trouble than Metro has. So if you have trouble with jump puzzles and that kind of thing, you might have trouble making that skip, so might be something to practice.
Was there any type of visual indicator that you used to ultimately overcome it?
I think what was the most successful for me was making sure that I was kind of pointed against the wall while I was jumping. I think that kind of helped the most, but I was just determined to force my way through it, and eventually I did.
So again, at this point, you could address any of the bosses in this area. There's a lot of options here, and to go left, all you do is just run through this area. There's no actual trash in this immediate place because this is part of the boss activation event. So it's a pretty nice little open area here, and it actually allows you to just sneak by the right here and go right into the mail room as well if that's what you want. So the decision on which boss to make is probably going to be pretty freeform, but I think it's going to come down to something a little bit more specific, and that's going to be when do you have your second bloodlust. A lot of times when you do these dungeons with 5 bosses, you really need to make sure you're pulling trash to accommodate the extra bloodlust on bosses, especially on a tyrannical week. This boss that we could do here at the Oasis is a much easier boss to not have bloodlust for, but it is a very long encounter, so it might end up being the other way around. We might end up having so much time in between the first boss and this next whatever the second boss would be that we can actually do this boss here. This boss is much more likely to cause problems if you don't have bloodlust. It's a much bigger DPS race, and in fact, if you've done this on hard mode, a lot of times people simply just have their healer switch to DPS and just try to kill this with 5 DPS because this boss actually has a lot of potential danger to it, and simply blowing the doors off it is the best way to do it. But for the sake of the video, let's go ahead and start with the Oasis because this trash is very interesting, and so is the boss. In order to activate this, we have to be able to walk through this gate, and this guy here is going to stop us. If you talk to him now, he's going to ask for a password, and you have to give him the right password. A lot of really cool little old references in this password system, but that's not necessarily relevant for Mythic Plus. The reason that you can't just immediately guess and get going here though is because the right answer is actually not on this list right now. So you could choose any of these and they're all wrong. The way you figure it out though is by helping this NPC deliver the goods to the different NPCs in this area. So we're going to go ahead and pick up the common drum here, and it's now going to be on the ground there, and all we need to do is take it to the purveyor of any of the objects that are most relevant to it. So this should be drum should be something instrumental, and as soon as you start that, the trash will begin. Whenever anybody picks up the item, there will also be mobs that are coming to potentially try to take the item back. Yep, and we got lucky there. We had the fancy instruments right next to where the drum spawned. That makes it a lot easier. I assume these mobs are never going to give any trash count at all, so making the right decision here is not necessarily going to be an expedient one, but also one that could potentially help your dungeon progression. So here we see the bizarre strong arm. So while the player with the object is trying to figure out where they have to go, this mob is going to relentlessly pursue them, and they can be slowed. Things like chains of ice, or maybe perhaps like a ring of peace or something like that, can help a lot. But if the person doesn't have any idea where they're going with the item, then it's going to be pretty dangerous. It's going to be very difficult to keep them alive during the mechanic.
I have no idea. I've never done it. I have no idea. I was waiting for you to pick the bloody thing up.
We also just discovered a very interesting thing. So Cop died there, and he released, and he's all the way back at the start. So this is another hot topic in Mythic Plus. Having a very poor checkpoint options is something that a lot of Mythic dungeons have done a very poor job of. Now, there is a checkpoint system built into Tazavesh, so we'll take a look at that too, maybe at the end of the video if I can remember. But yes, typically don't want to be dying and running back here, because especially if you're skipping trash out of the gate, it's going to be pretty difficult to get back here, and it's a very long run if you're not actually using those portals. But the main takeaway here is just identifying what the object is. For example, the bolt of silk here. Bolt of silk will be taken over here to the expert tailor, and I'm not exactly sure how many different options there are, and it can be pretty stressful if you don't actually know what the different options are. But it's not a bad idea to just take a look at all of these options. We have fancy instruments, that's going to be the drum, exotic spices, we have rare texts, we have expert tailor, we have things like magical weapons back here, and precious gemstones. I have a feeling that these are different every time you'll do the dungeon. Maybe it'll be something a little bit more repeatable than that, so knowing exactly where they are is going to be the problem, but at least knowing what they do and what the different options are. We have fossil collectors, we have alchemists, and we have fine cuisine. So I believe that's all of the options here. You just have to figure out where they are and then know which item goes where and quickly take them there. Obviously, the less time you spend in this area, the better, because you're not getting any count for this whatsoever, it appears, and this is a really big time sink if you don't do this accurately and swiftly. So all you have to do is simply do this 3 times, and then you're going to get the password from the 3rd vendor. Come closer, stranger. The password is pale flower. So of course you remember none of those were the options when we were looking at the list of what we had before. They were all just kind of references to old things in WoW. This is a completely unique option. The other problem with this area is that once you start this event, these mobs are here for good. So it's definitely a really good idea to quickly get out of this area as well, because if you don't, you're going to be in here wasting a lot of time trying to get where you're going. On top of the Bazaar strong arm, also trying to get to your player carrying the item, these mobs are also going to be putting this static cling on anybody they're attacking, and that's going to slow you down, making it even harder to progress through this area. So now that we have the password, we're simply going to talk to him, find pale flower. As you see, these are all actually different now as well, which is interesting. I didn't recognize this. Talk to him, input pale flower as the password, and we're moving on to the next boss room. So this is a very unique area in the fact that you're basically coming into a bar that has active musicians playing, and they're playing so poorly that the brokers in the area are trying to get them off the stage. We're going to have to take their place and play their instruments to better success than they are, which will eventually not end up happening, and will aggro the owner of the bar, and he will come down here and we'll have to fight him as the boss. There's a little bit of an RP here. This does take a while, so like I said, we're trying to make sure that we're making the right choice with how long it's going to take to get through these bosses, to make sure we have heroism or bloodlust at the right time. So once you have the object, all you're trying to do is use it in a way that will give you these buffs. Every time you successfully use the object, which will be different every time depending on the object, you will be getting a buff here of a stacking paste buff, and once you get enough, it'll turn into an actual full-on buff that will give you something very powerful to deal with this trash quicker. But otherwise, it's just a little bit of a gauntlet of trash, and even if you don't do the horn improvisation or whatever item you picked up, it won't really be that big of a deal. You'll just simply be missing out on the buff. Trash is doing some mechanics that can be interrupted as well, and on top of that, this disruptive patron is going to constantly be trying to blink around and get away from you using this teleport ability. So really good time to be a blood DK. You can simply grip it back and continue to cleave it down, but otherwise, if you don't have a DK in the group, you're going to probably want to kite this trash on top of wherever he ends up, so everything could be cleaved down a little bit faster. Every time you kill the trash, though, we'll be able to use the weapon or the instruments again. This should be pretty straightforward, but for this one, we're just kind of walking in between the 3 objects and then hitting our extra action button. I think the guitar that Cop has is something like you slide through the notes. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then after we get so many stacks, you will see we have up tempo, damage and healing increased by 25%, with haste increased by 25% as well. So I think that's provided that you do all of them right, or to some degree you do them in order. And once you have that, then you're obviously going to do a lot more damage here. And this is kind of key to making sure this area goes as fast as possible, because as you've seen so far, we have not gotten any trash percent from this area, even though this is a huge amount of non-boss stuff that we have to do. So Wasted Security is doing this ability that I talked about, Menacing Shout, and this does a lot more damage than I expected. We're doing it here, and missing these interrupts are actually causing Cop to die here. So yeah, it's something to keep in mind. Could be more dangerous than it looks, and I bet on Tyrannical Week you probably won't notice it, but on Fortified Week, these types of missed interrupts might actually be really bad. And it's just ultimately a real salt in the wound, because if you're not surviving this trash and it's not giving you any count, it could be really bad for your overall time and score in the dungeon. So after 3 rounds of trash, we now have the boss, who's actually coming with the seasonal effects relics again, so have another opportunity to get that as well. This boss, honestly, very straightforward encounter. Again, we have some interrupts that we want to make sure we're doing, and just making sure this is not going to cause any further problems for you guys. Here's one of the mechanics here. We're going to have a mob that the boss's mechanic is going to pull you in. At the same time, he's also going to give you another chance to use your instrument. So if you have the guitar, for example, you can simply use the guitar to slide out of the mechanic while you soak them. Otherwise, you're going to have to be a little bit more coordinated with what you're doing and when. Pretty good opportunity to miss the instrument there, but it is a very nice DPS buff, especially on top of the actual pace buff we're going to get from potentially doing the seasonal effects in that order. Other than that, he also does the crowd control, but he also has the shield mechanic. And we want to just make sure that we're standing behind the shield, just like we had on the first boss, similar to that. Suppression Spark is that mechanic there. We want to make sure that we get out of that and then quickly get back in and use the instrument. An interrupting Menacing Shout, just like we saw in the trash. And then again, the frontal. Okay, so that crowd control mechanic is a frontal. Just make sure you're not standing in front of the little gray line that he has and dodge that. And that's pretty much it. Very, very, very simple trash. Very, very simple boss. But the fact that they're all in one area and they don't actually advance you anywhere other than one boss kill, it can be very difficult and probably very time consuming. So any deaths or mistakes here can cause a lot more problems than you'd realize.
Yeah, I can definitely see this being a boss that once you get the hang of it is just easy mode.
Yep, very few actual mechanics to do. It's more about just killing him fast to be efficient with the timer. Now we're going to go potentially do one of the hardest bosses in the dungeon. But again, you can do it in any order. We can go over to the left instead if we prefer, or we can now go into the mailroom. One way or the other, after we kill the mailroom, we are going to have to go left. So let's go ahead and do that now and start taking a look at what's going on trash-wise in here, because this is where the density really gets heavy. And if you don't make the right decision with what's in this room, we might actually be under count here. So I think starting over here seems like a really good idea, especially because we have the relics here. We have 2 peacekeepers who are going to have a whole new set of mechanics that we haven't seen before. They're doing this phalanx field, and this is actually a mechanic that makes them take a lot less spell damage, but also reflects incoming spell damage to the caster. So if you're somebody who's trying to put dots up on them, it's very likely going to reflect your dots onto you, and they'll take almost no damage from it. Now that ability on the upcast especially can be stunned. I believe if you try to stun it when the shield is up though, you'll probably be stunned yourself. And of course we have to contend with the patrol that we skipped earlier now walking into us. All in all, the trash is much more combinable in this area than in previous areas though, as most of the mechanics simply being either dodge them or just deal with them in a slow way, and instead of having to worry about massive amounts of interrupts and potentially fatal failures to do so. But here's a good example of how things can quickly get out of control. We have these mobs blinking all around, and now they're aggroing extra stuff, and now we're pretty much in a position where we're near wiping, and I think in a real Mythic Plus scenario, this absolutely would be a wipe. We were now fighting about 3 to 4 packs where we always wanted to only fight 1 pack at a time. So now that we wiped here, we have an opportunity to take a look at how navigating this dungeon after a wipe might potentially look. So there's these portals listed around the dungeon, and you probably don't need to worry about them. Obviously dying and wiping is not really what you want to do, but this one is a really good one to take because it basically takes you to a really central location in the dungeon. So we're going to go ahead and activate this here, and now anytime we run in it, it should take us back to the beginning where we fought the first boss. And as you see, once we're back here, there is a bunch of them. Now, some of them take you to places that are only accessible in the second half of the dungeon, so I don't think they're really relevant, but just be aware that this one here is incredibly important. So it'd be a really good idea if, regardless of how your dungeon is going in terms of success, you come up here and activate this portal just in case somebody does die. Then whenever they spawn, they'll be back in that first room, and they can simply spawn and jump right through that portal and come here as well. So as I said, navigating this area is particularly tricky, and as you see here, we can't actually skip both of those packs, but that is a patrol, so sometimes you might be able to walk right by them. And I think it's going to depend a lot on where you're at with count and what you'd like to do in terms of finishing with count. So this area has a lot of trash in it, and it's very freeform, but there is still trash in front of the potential second boss there. So making the right decisions on what to pull here is going to be more important than you realize. What we're also going to see in this area is this commerce enforcer. So we're going to see a few of these. 2 of them are up there by the mini boss that we have to kill to activate and go into the final boss, but right here is a patrolling one. Now I'm going to show you this pack here because this is a very complicated pack. We have 2 casters here. We're just going to sit out there and cast, and we have the enforcer doing that power kick. Okay, so that mechanic there is going to knock your tank back. Very easy to potentially not have an issue there. We're also going to see this force multiplier, which is actually an enrage, so very likely to be able to be removed by a druid or anybody who has an enrage spell, hunter and rogue. But yeah, the knockback is what is probably going to be the biggest issue. We also have this stacking debuff. That's the scintillate cast. Anytime they get this cast off, they're putting this debuff on us. That's just making us take more damage from any arcane source, which is of course what they're doing to us. But yeah, not getting knocked back into other trash is going to be incredibly important there, and making sure that if you do fight these mobs, you put yourself in a position where you can recover from a mistake will be very likely paramount to succeeding in this area. We also have these weird little walls here where if you walk through that, you get stunned for a short period of time. So this could also come into play if you get knocked back into them. That might actually cause a wipe if you're fighting these enforcers and they knock you into these walls. Otherwise, you can just kind of walk around them. But here we have the most important decision of the dungeon. How do we navigate from this side to that side? I would imagine one of the most efficient ways to do this is simply not go that direction and instead go up and around, because you pretty much have to kill this stuff anyway. We have the mini boss that you need to kill in order to access the console, and we have a much more yeah, it's a lot more likely to be not dangerous to go this way here. So I think I'm probably going to clear this out, then come up here and we'll fight this mini boss. And again, it'll depend on when CDs are up, but he also does this power kick, and there you see one of the most lethal mechanics he has. He's going to put these balls on the ground, and he's then going to try to kick you into them. He also did a mechanic there that you might not have immediately noticed, but he's going to link two players together. Yeah, so we have this lethal force being pulled towards another player. If we touch them, it puts a dot on us that's going to do a ton of damage. So basically the whole time you want to make sure that you stay away from that person, which can be particularly difficult if you're the tank and you get kicked into them. So we gained a good amount of count from that, went from 58 to 64, and I'm pretty sure that guy is mandatory. I'm pretty sure there's no possible way to click that without him, but maybe you could actually stealth past him somehow and click it. But in order to access that console, as you see, there's three openings here. Our cartel signature, there's going to be a cartel signature for all three. We have to fill those up by killing all three bosses in order to advance. So now once we're up here, we need to make the decision on how we want to navigate. Try to quickly bang a hard through right in there. You could actually see there's actually another portal there which we could use to our advantage, but we do end up aggroing that stuff there, so that might be a little bit more complicated than it looks. But at this point, like I said, I think we just want to avoid these patrols and just quickly come down along the side here, because then we'll be able to have a much more we'll have a much easier access to where we want to go here for the rest of the dungeon. However you choose to navigate to this side, if you do choose to clear this out, you'll now have a very interesting concept here where you can actually activate this again and potentially use it to get back to the other side by going in and out of the previous portals. Maybe that's faster, I don't really know, especially if you plan on avoiding these patrols. You might end up doing it to save some time. But otherwise, we're going to head into the Grand Menagerie. Here is going to be what will be our third boss here. And this has a very interesting little thing hidden away here. If you see over here, comp, we have a proto-drake captured in this cave here, which has been something that a lot of people have been speculating might lead to the next expansion. What do you think about that?
Oh, it's a gorgeous model. That's actually a nice proto-drake. I never liked the proto-drake models from Wrath. It was never. I disliked them vehemently, but that looks gorgeous. I love it.
Okay, so here's the next boss. We have basically a three-pronged boss. Each time we kill one of the bosses, he's going to leave one of the mechanics on the ground basically for the next boss to potentially interact with. So the first mechanic here, you see this big blue circle. We're going to dodge that, but we also have this gluttony. It's called gluttony, and it's going to play a much bigger role later. As of right now, it simply does a small amount of damage to the person with it, but eventually it's going to be crucial to making sure you do the mechanic properly. And here's another mechanic. We just need to make sure basically half the room fills with those orbs, and then you move on to that half after they expire and dodge the other half. So this is another boss that you might have some trouble using Bloodlust on, because I think if you get a Bloodlust at the wrong time here, it can be pretty pointless. I think the ideal situation here would be to Bloodlust on the third portion of the boss, just like you might see currently in Theater of Pain, Bloodlusting at the end. A lot of that is timing specific too, so there might be a route that ultimately leads to this a little bit easier. You also see that in the other side where the route actually plays in perfectly to when you want to Bloodlust, and I think that's something they probably consider here, especially with how freeform this middle area of the dungeon is. But Bloodlusting on the start here really doesn't help you at all, because this first part of the fight is extremely simple. It's just moving out of mechanics and killing a single target. But I guess after you get the boss to a certain percentage, the second boss is going to join us, so now we have both bosses together. And as you see, this first mechanic is now going to be used to do this fight too. So here, this mechanic here, this purification protocol, that's going to go out on two people every time. Two people get it, one person is going to have to be dispelled, and then the second person probably won't be able to be dispelled because it's a magic debuff. But here we have the venting protocol. So this is what you're going to use this gluttony for. You're going to go ahead and pick up these orbs, and they're going to give you a massive damage done buff. If you pick them up without having the debuff, you're going to actually lose damage. So it's very important that you pay attention when you're doing this and making sure that you deal with that, because what you want to use this damage buff for is killing this guy's shield. The faster you kill the shield, the quicker you can stop that mechanic, which is doing a lot of damage to us. You see this flagellation protocol, he's just going to keep channeling this damage on me until we do enough damage to break the shield and stop the mechanic. The good thing is, once you get that guy out of the fight, he doesn't actually attack you anymore, so probably a good idea to either use Heroism or Bloodlust during the transition in between the two bosses, or at the end when potentially maybe even three bosses are up. But I do think, it can get very dangerous if you don't try to kill that first guy. He's going to still continue to do his mechanics, and then once he's gone, it's just the previous mechanic gluttony comes with you into this next boss, and again, you're using that to your benefit anyway, so As long as everybody who doesn't have it is paying attention to not get hit by the orbs, and the person who does have it is soaking as many of them as possible, you've done everything you can with that mechanic. So it looks like at about 40%, the next boss is going to activate, which is going to come down, and this would be a really good time to pop all your offense, because this is going to be the hardest overlap here. And again, I do think you want to try to kill the robot guy as fast as possible, so you don't have to worry about any extra danger on this fight. But we have the Chains of Domination mechanic going on over there. That's just a massive slow, which is pretty important because you're still dealing with mechanics that are going to move you around the room and potentially kill you if you're not in the right spot, like this one whirling annihilation there. That's going to try to drag you into the boss. And, you know, with Blood Decay, you can just use Death's Advance to prevent that drag, but everyone else is going to have to make sure they actively run away from it, because the closer you are to the center of that mechanic, the more damage you take from it. Now, the mechanic that the robot boss leaves when he dies is he continues to shoot out these orbs. So these two mechanics are going to exist on the rest of the fight, and he's also going to leave this puddle on the ground. So he died in a very unfortunate spot. We definitely want to make sure we're moving the boss out of that. Otherwise, everybody who's melee is going to have a lot of trouble potentially doing anything there. But you see, this can be a pretty hectic fight, especially if the person who has the gluttony is not actively soaking and removing the orbs. I think what you want to do is just try to keep the area around the boss clear, and then just make sure that everybody else is trying to actively dodge them, because it's going to be a pretty big DPS loss if you get hit by this. Damage done decreased from 2 stacks, only 10% damage reduction. So if you got multiple stacks of that, you're quickly going to become very ineffective on the fight. And so I can already tell, Cop, you're having a lot of trouble just finding a spot to fight the boss. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I tend to think that a lot of that has to do with the overlapping mechanics and the fact that there's only 2 of us. You know, ordinarily you'd probably have one person who's running around and soaking stuff, who's not the tank. That you would have at least a couple of DPS who are able to keep the pace going, and the healers at keeping people up. And it would feel a lot less dangerous than this does, right? Because we don't have a healer or a couple other DPS to help us along. So
yeah, so you're probably right about that. My immediate inclination on this fight, though, is not going to be what you described. I think it's probably going to be handled very similar to how people like to do the robot boss in Spires, where they just let the mechanics come to them and try to maintain 100% uptime on the fight, the person who's soaking the balls there. I'd imagine it's going to be the same thing here. So the person without that is just expected to stay in range of the boss, do full damage, and move out of the whirling annihilation, while the person with that is simply blocking you know, the orbs, so they're not accidentally coming on and hitting the person who is not with the mechanic.
I was just going to say that blue swirly, if you don't have it, does it do damage to you? Like, if you have the blue swirly and I'm standing on top of you, will I take damage from that blue swirly?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. 5.5k shadow damage inflicted to nearby allies, it says, so yeah. Okay, so that might be a little bit more complicated. It depends on how dangerous that actually is for the overall pacing of the fight.
I think that was one of the things I was looking at actively trying to avoid, too, was when you had the blue thing to not be on top of you, and when I had it, to be away from you enough that it wasn't doing damage to you, so.
Yeah, that fight is pretty straightforward on the normal difficulty, Mythic 0 and stuff, and even on hard mode, but that could be one of the harder fights in here because there's basically 3 bosses scaling with Tyrannical, and that could make it very difficult. So let's go ahead and do this here. We're going to go back into the portal. We'll be back in the first boss room, and then we'll quickly run across the way here and go to the other side so we don't have to worry about accidentally aggroing any of those patrols, and then we'll be back ready to do the Postmaster boss. So in here we have a lot of trash, and this is some of the more interesting trash in the dungeon because it's all pretty much very heavily oriented upon dealing damage to you, but one of them is going to give you a great boon, and that is this male elemental, the arcane elemental looking mob. When it dies, it's going to put down a basically like a shield, and if you stand in that, you get a lot of haste. But until it does, we have the chickens that stun you. We have a lot of mechanics just kind of happening that are just doing passive damage to each other. So this is a really good time to probably either choose to pull really big and use a lot of offense, or potentially play very defensively here and make sure that you're using as many things like stuns and potentially interrupts to your benefit. But yeah, as you see here, being in the shield is a 50% haste increase, and this can be used for the boss. So it would be very likely that maximizing your time in this room could potentially make a big swing in the dungeon's success rate. When we used to do this on hard mode back in the day, we used to make sure that we aggroed all of those male elementals last, and then kill them last as well, and just make sure that we used multiple of the overlapping debuffs to our benefit, and it would make the boss a lot easier to quickly burn down. But again, at this point, you really want to try to kill these elementals last so you can take the shield into the boss, because this is definitely going to be the boss you want Bloodlust for the most. The quicker you get through this fight, the better. And even though you definitely want to try to get as many Bloodlusts in here as possible, I think this is a route-defining lust here, especially on any Tyrannical week. You really want to make sure that if you need extra trash, or you want to do another boss first instead, this is the way you're thinking about it, with this boss either being the most awkward or potentially the most planned around to make sure that you have lust and you maximize this whole room very well here. So right there, how we pull that early, that really helps us get this initial haste here, but it's going to be pretty aggressive, so you want to make sure that if you're doing that, you know what you're doing. Now this boss has a lot of really strange mechanics in the fact that it's a lot of soaking and moving. Anytime you see those purple pillars, if you stand in that, it's going to not put one of these debuffs down. And these debuffs are very dangerous because they're going to eventually fill up the whole room. The next mechanic here is this money order. You need to be able to soak this. It's going to do a lot of magic damage, and if only one person gets hit by it, surely they're going to die. But here's the main mechanic here, these bombs, okay? So these bombs are incredibly important because when they expire, they do a lot of damage as a fire damage. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to take these to these activated delivery portals and toss them in there. And I think it's pretty unrealistic that you're going to get them all, but I think it's a very good idea to try. So even if you don't get them all, even getting probably, 2 or 3 of them removed from the fight makes it a lot more survivable. And again, it puts a magic dot on you that can actually be AMS. So if they are going to go off and you're a DK or something like Prop Paladin or Rogue, you can actually just prevent them from killing you by AMSing when they start to expire, and the mechanic won't actually go on you. Instead, it'll just do the damage, and then the dot won't actually apply to you. The hard part about this mechanic, though, is seeing where you actually have to take them, because as you see here, we've done obviously an incredibly poor job of clearing the puddles on the room, so we would have to potentially move into the puddles to pick up the mechanics, and that's why and then see it changes in the middle of the mechanic. And now it's actually just gone, it looks like, or maybe it's going to open up somewhere else. Not really sure.
Over there.
Ah, yeah, okay. Okay,
on the far
over
side.
there. So that's another problem with this fight. It makes it very difficult to execute well. And typically, like I said, you can just actually bloodlust and potentially avoid all of these things. And if you did that, certainly like we did on Mythic 0, that would make it very easy, but unlikely to happen on any real key level. And I would say the takeaway here is just simply do as much damage as possible, because the hard part about this mechanic is actually getting all 6 of those packages thrown away. And I think you'll probably get used to watching these kind of mail shoots change. You'll know when and where that's happening. The more experience you get, the more add-ons develop. You'll know when and where that happens. But the amount of times that happens where I pick up one of those packages and then the shoot I'm kind of lumbering over to is actually being turned inactive, it's very frustrating. It makes the fight very unfun to do. And it makes it very difficult too, because all the time I'm running over to that is time I'm not DPSing. So perhaps there's ways to delegate who's doing it. Obviously, maybe a ranged DPS, maybe a healer, something with a pet so the damage can continue from their pet. But I think a lot of people are simply just trying to kill him as fast as possible, so they have to deal with as few of those mechanics as they humanly can. And again, that's a Mythic 0 hard mode strategy. Impossible to just simply kill it before those packages come out, surely, which is what people try to do on that difficulty. But I definitely think you can probably kill, before maybe the second set comes out or the third set comes out, and that could be a big swing. Having to stop and do that is a huge DPS loss. And it's also important to recognize that when that mechanic comes out, you have a good 30 seconds before any of them start exploding. So if you do find yourself in that position, you could simply just ignore them and finish the burn. But it's definitely going to be a pretty tough decision to make. So anyway, now that we've killed all 3 of the bosses in this area, it's time to go upstairs. And that's it. We're done with count. So at this point, you need to have made a decision. How do you want to get count? Originally, when we started this video, I thought we were going to be way over count, because I figured a lot of this area trash here would be giving a lot more. But, we did make some skips, and we did choose to go right instead of left. So I'm sure there's a lot of flexibility to be had. But regardless, hopefully you've learned something about how you want to do the route by watching this, because it does feel like it's kind of super optional. Typically, when stuff is super optional in WoW, people just kind of crunch the numbers on it to the point where nothing's optional and you take the most optimized route through it. And that'll probably develop, but just be aware that it's not Blizzard forcing you to do that. That might be something that does become a meta and way to kind of enforce a better timer throughout the dungeon. But Blizzard obviously is allowing you to pull any of these bosses in any order and pull any of this trash in any order as well. In fact, you can always come back down here and do the trash after this, but it is definitely very possible to skip these 2 mobs on the side. And you can simply just walk up here and activate the dais, and we're off to the final boss. Now, this is one of the most interesting bosses in the entire game, not just Mythic Plus. This could easily be a raid boss. This is how cool this is. This boss's concept is something I've never seen before. Basically, she's going to put up a bunch of walls, and the only way to actually navigate those walls is to go into a little bit of a device that matches with another one in the room that's going to portal you between the two. Okay, it'll be very obvious if you've never seen it. We're going to show it here, but it's incredibly important that you understand that. And the shapes are what you're looking for. So there'll be 2 circles, and the circles will take you, the 2 boxes, they'll take you in between, and the 2 triangles, they'll take you in between. And navigating these 4 areas of this room is how you do every mechanic in the fight. There's going to be a wave that she shoots out. You're going to have to make sure you take that portal into the wave so you don't get hit by it. Otherwise, you're going to take a lot of damage from that. And there's also going to be the boss blinking in between these 4 areas and doing a cast that needs to be interrupted. Now, on hard mode, you need to interrupt it multiple times in a row, and that's what makes that so hard. But luckily on normal mode, that's not going to be a feature. So Mythic Plus, you won't have to deal with that, but still making sure somebody can get through these walls and get that interrupt is still going to be very important. Now, you can also blink through this boss. So this is pretty cool too. If you're a mage or you're a Night Fae, you can simply ignore all of this stuff and just blink through it. And almost everything, I think actually everything on this encounter is magic. So yet again, if you fail at any of it, AMS is going to save you. But here you see these little like pillars with the rectangle or, you know, a circle on them, and they're going to match up. And if you see I go in this one, I'm going to come out over here, and actually, yeah, there we go. And that's completely inconsequential right now, but as the fight progresses, more and more mechanics are going to come out. So here you go. You see we can take this triangle one, and we're basically going to disappear into that mechanic, and it won't have done any damage to us. But here's the first wall, and you see we need to get over there quickly and interrupt that so I can get the first interrupt. Cop's dead. He won't be able to get the second, but it doesn't actually matter because as a blood DK, since this is magic damage, I can just AMS as the cast ends, and it doesn't do anything to me. But this is an incredibly dangerous mechanic. It does a ton of damage, but regardless, you're not going to be able to do that when it's actually Mythic Plus. You're going to have to actually interrupt that, and it requires 2 people to interrupt, so you might want to assign who is interrupting and make sure the first person gets theirs, and then the second person is ready after theirs, because if both people try to get the first one and it puts both CDs on, it makes both on cooldown, then you might accidentally miss that and you'll be in serious trouble. But then as the fight continues, there's going to be more walls. Now we have the peak of it. I think it's probably based on the boss's health pool. Okay, so now we have to quickly go over there so I can come over here and get the first interrupt. Oh, I just realized we never even aggroed the relics. I guess you have to get pretty close to them to even aggro, which might be a bug, might get changed, but looks like you could actually skip pulling the relics here if you didn't want to. And that's it, just dodging this mechanic. And this gets harder and harder as it goes because, of course, now we have to wait for the right time to do it. We can't just go from one side to the other and expect to be safe with 4 areas. And I accidentally just made that mistake where I went back in without meaning to. So yeah, pretty potentially a very difficult fight. Especially depending on how hard it's going to be tuned. You can see I'm taking a lot of damage from that, but again, that's magic, so I can simply just AMS and it won't actually kill me. It won't even do anything to me. So a fight like that, I feel like a fight like that and Pop don't go well together. How do you feel about that fight?
I feel, yeah, you're right, but thing is, what actually got me there for that last death was there comes a point where to get from where you are to this inside the circle, sometimes you're going to have to teleport more than once, right? Like, there may only be, like, the circle inside there, and there may only be the square where you're standing at, in the quadrant you're standing at. So you might have to do a double jump, and that's where things become really, really difficult.
Yeah, that's probably one of the main reasons the fight's difficult at all is because, yeah, sometimes you have to go from one area to the next just to make sure that you can get out of the first area. Yeah, so I think I discovered why the relics didn't aggro, because when you aggro the boss for the first time, it actually walks forward and is here kind of waiting for you because of the RP but now it's back in its normal recess there, so that's going to aggro now. On Cop, you just put your portal down. Is that something you think you can use on this fight?
I think maybe, yeah, I can use my Transcendence. I'm not sure. I think it's going to take a lot of time for me to figure out where the best place to put that is, but I've got Transcendence. I've got my Door Shadows, which I should be able to use if I've got enough time. There's a lot of different ways you can get across those boundaries. It's just, you have to have awareness enough to use them. And not panic is the big thing.
Cool thing about the boss too is once you go from one side to the other, it'll actually blink over to your side so you can actually attack it as well. You don't have to worry about it coming. It's just going to go ahead and do that on its own. So I think the big takeaway on that boss is you just need to really make sure you're making the smart decision there. The boss doesn't particularly have that much health, and obviously on Tyrannical that'll change, but just making sure you're not getting caught in a spot where your healer can't heal you, or potentially getting caught in one of the mechanics is probably going to be the big mistake. I think even if you kill this boss slowly, this is going to be a boss that can absolutely break a run. There's really two bosses in here, and that's the mail room and this boss. Those two bosses need to be you need to be very ready for them. And I don't really know how much something like Bloodlust or Heroism will actually help on this boss, because you'll just be pushing him into the phases where he's doing more mechanics quicker. So I did see that he, when we had those Death Stare, we were practicing doing the fight, he actually did more than 2 of the mechanics that you have to double interrupt. So I guess that's not necessarily, it's probably more time based, but yeah, certainly the more safe you be here, the more likely you will survive. And just making sure that everybody's together too. I think in an ideal situation, the whole group would be moving from spot to spot together and never getting separated, but that's extremely unlikely to happen in a pug. So yeah, just figure out what you want to do route wise. I think this is going to be a huge talking point in this dungeon. The next Tazavesh dungeon we're going to take a look at is going to be kind of the opposite in that way, very linear. There's not really many options in that dungeon. You're just going to keep going in a straight line, so that should be a little bit more stable in terms of how you route it. But this one's going to have a lot of options, and like I said, Blizzard is giving you those options, but I'm sure eventually a route that you might want to follow will come out. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for a long time, me and Cop coming in here. Do you have any closing thoughts on this dungeon, Cop?
It's just, yeah, it's a really interesting place. I mean, we've seen, like, there's a mail that you can actually use and an auctioneer that you can actually use inside of Mythic Plus, which is just huge.
Yeah, there is mailboxes scattered around the dungeon, so in case you ever need to use the mailbox in a Mythic Plus, you can. But if you want to do it in a fancy way, you can come talk to little Catherine here. She's going to open up your mail for you. But perhaps most interesting about all of this is that you can actually go and use the auction house while you're in here. So you can just go back to where the first boss is, and the guys behind kind of where the trash was. There will be an auction house here, and you can use that and potentially buy stuff while you're in the key. So not really sure if there will ever be a circumstance where that will be useful, but between the auction house and the different mailboxes, it's a pretty unique dungeon. So what else? What do you think about the actual mechanics?
They are every bit as unforgiving as they were when it was just a Mythic Zero, which I think is tantamount to what you would expect for something like this, for the to compare to the one from Legion or from BFA, the Mega Dungeons. This is comparable on difficulty, and I think until people get used to doing it regularly, because not many people have done it a lot, it's going to be one of those ones that people are going to dread. Get your practice in now.
And perhaps most bizarrely, we were actually able to go on to the second half of the Mythic Plus dungeon by entering the portal, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that's a bug. But yeah, I wonder what would have happened if we didn't finish count, if we could have come up here and actually continued on. I don't know why that would be possible, but anyway, I hope everybody has learned something here. If you have any questions at all, please ask them down below. I'm going to be heavily interested in helping people learn this dungeon, because frankly, one of the least fun things coming out in that final season is usually the fact that there's a new dungeon that nobody knows. So doing that in a pug environment can be pretty unfriendly. So I'm doing my part to spread the word. So thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.